Research on effective apologies shows something really important. The strongest apologies are not just the ones that say, I'm sorry. They include ownership and they include repair, which makes sense if we think about it, because when someone is actually hurt, they usually do not just need to hear that you feel bad. They need to know that you understand what the heck happened between the two of you, that you can own your part, and that something will be different moving forward. A real apology is not performance guilt, not at all. It is an act of sheer accountability.
Hey there, Evolver. If you have found this channel, you're probably someone who thinks deeply about life, growth, and the human mind. My name is Amelia, and this is a channel where we explore the psychology, neuroscience, and lived experience of what it actually means to evolve as a human being.
In my work with individuals, couples, and leaders, this is one of the places where repair often breaks down. Not because people never apologize. As a matter of fact, people apologize all the time. I'd like to see that number go up, but many people, if we look at the facts, they do apologize, or at least they try. But the apology itself becomes way more about reducing their own discomfort than actually repairing the rupture itself. They say something like, I'm sorry, but, or I didn't mean it that way. Or my favorite, I've already apologized. I don't understand what you're looking for. Or something along the lines of, I feel terrible. Why are you still upset? Or I guess I'm just a horrible person. And when some of those, right, those responses might come across with real distress, and they might literally come from that level of distress someone's feeling, they often shift that focus away from the impact of why they're there in the first place. The person who is hurt now has to manage the apologizer's shame, defensiveness, or collapse. And that, my friends, is not repair. That is a second rupture. So in our last video, we talked about rupture and repair. The idea that healthy relationships are not, in fact, rupture-free. As a matter of fact, they are what I like to call repair-rich. And I love the way in which that sounds. It just has a good ring to it. But repair itself requires way more than wanting things to just go back to normal. It requires something that I find in couples, leaders, individuals, families, we're not that great at. And what is that? Well, it requires accountability. Because if we rush totally back into that connection without full-blown understanding and actually deep understanding of the impact that just happened, the nervous system does not, in fact, experience any level of safety. Instead, what it experiences is that pressure to just move on. And if you've been in that position, you know exactly what that feels like. So this video is all about how to apologize in a way that actually supports repair, not does the opposite. An apology, let's kind of look at the architecture. I think that's where we'll start. The architecture of an apology. So an apology says, I'm sorry. Accountability, on the other hand, says, hey, I understand what happened, and I understand how it impacted you, and I'm willing to take responsibility for my part. Those two are so different. A person can say, I'm sorry, without actually taking responsibility. And as a matter of fact, I have seen it happen way more times than I would like to happen, because ultimately it does way more damage than the initial damage that's done. And I've even been there at one point or another in my life. And when a person can feel guilty without repairing anything, that is not real repair. Guilt is not the repair. Ownership is. So let's kind of think about this in terms of real day-to-day examples. I have a couple written down here in front of me, like I do with practically all of the videos on Eve. And I find that giving some examples are helpful for us to really integrate some of these awarenesses or lessons learned into our skill set. So I have a person's name written down, just so happens to be a client, who tends to find themselves in that defensive apology type strategy. And let's give a simple example. This is kind of what's happening inside of them all the time, and we're working through it. So, for example, if you're in that chair, you're saying something sharply during a hard conversation. You notice your words are not as smooth or as soft as you'd like. And later, what you end up realizing in one way, shape, or form, it hurt the other person. A defensive apology may sound something like, I'm sorry, but I was overwhelmed. You hear that in my voice? Now, that may be true. Yes, that you were overwhelmed. Of course, we hear that. But if the first thing you do is explain your state, the other person may just feel like you are asking them to understand you before you understand them. A cleaner apology, on the other hand, might sound like something like, I'm sorry, my tone, it was sharp. And I can see that it landed as really dismissive. I was overwhelmed, but I still want to own how I spoke to you. Can you imagine someone saying that to you? That is totally different. It includes the context without using the context as an excuse. A mature apology can, in fact, include context, but context itself should never help explain the behavior and never just simply erase the impact. And that is key. Now, person number 2 written down in front of me. This is someone who falls into what we call the shame collapse apology type. This is where the pattern of just collapsing into themselves whenever they need to go near within a 10-foot pole near an apology, you'll notice by what I described they go through. They just collapse. So an example of this is where someone says, I guess I'm just terrible. I always mess everything up. I'm such a bad partner. Or cue the cross-armed response. I guess I can't do anything right. That may sound on the surface like accountability, especially to an untrained ear, but often it is not. Because now the focus itself shifts. The person who is hurt may, in fact, feel the pressure, and it's so unconscious and so sneaky, but they may feel that pressure to reassure that person. No, you're not terrible. No, babe, you're not a bad partner. Or no, come on, we don't have to go there. Right? It shifts. So the original impact itself, what does it do? Well, nowhere to be found because the focus just got shifted. The impact itself just got lost. So a more accountable version, in contrast, sounds like something along the lines of this. I notice I want to collapse into shame right now, but I do not want to make you take care of that. I want to stay with what happened. I hurt you, and I want to understand that. That is powerful. Why? Because, well, it keeps the responsibility with the person who caused the harm. Shame, it says I am bad at the core of who I am. Accountability, on the other hand, says I did something that had an impact and I can respond to it. And that distinction matters. And so often the person who is finding themselves in this pattern forgets that, was never taught that, maybe had no one model that growing up. Example number 3. Shout out to many of the leaders that I work with. Leadership and professional accountability is bar none, you cannot separate them. When you're leading a team or individuals and there is a missed deadline or confusion, or you contributed in some way, shape, or form to something not going as optimally as the team, the deadlines, the projects that you're working on would have, really benefited from, it's really important to name that impact. And that's where professional accountability shows up. So picture the third name that I have written down. This person's a leader of a huge team. And it shows up in their leadership all the time. A leader makes a decision that creates confusion for the team. Maybe they change the priorities a little too quickly, or maybe they just communicated a little bit too late what that priority was. Or here's another example. Maybe they even gave unclear direction and then got frustrated when people did not execute well or on time. A weak apology, or one that doesn't have the conscious leadership developed embedded within that apology, might sound like, "Hey guys, sorry for the confusion." That is not nothing. It's vague. That is dismissive. If you notice, it doesn't have strong accountability. So, Amelia, what the heck does strong accountability or a stronger accountability statement sound like? I find giving language to things like these can really help us practice a little bit. So, a stronger accountability statement might in fact be, "Hey guys, I want to take a minute. Can I have your attention?" Picture like the classic Zoom room. So I want to just peel back on something, and I want to own my part in the confusion that's happening here. I changed the priority without really giving enough context, and that made it a lot harder for the team to execute. And I see that now, looking back and moving forward. I'll make sure decision that changes, including the why of what we're doing or the timeline, and what it is no longer the priority, or when it's no longer the priority, I'll make sure to include all those elements because I realize I didn't. So when we look at that repair, what does it do? It repairs trust because it names the specific impact and the adjustment. So in the three examples that we have, if we look at this a little bit from that vantage point of leadership in general, when it comes to this apology cycle, the art of apology repair, learning the language of this, we are all kind of navigating and stewarding what I like to call self-leadership. And on the topic of leadership, one thing that I want to include that I often hear from my leaders is that accountability, leaders often have this limiting belief that they have, which is accountability weakens their authority. If they were to apologize and include that level of a statement, then no longer will they have the respect of their team. However, it couldn't be more opposite of that, actually. And in fact, the research shows that in leadership, accountability does not weaken authority. The opposite. It strengthens it because people trust leaders way more who can own the impact without losing clarity. So if you are in fact in that situation, let's keep that in mind. Now, let's shift gears a little bit because I want to talk about the nervous system a little bit. Why does this happen? Why do we go into maybe a little bit more of that surface level apology than really naming the impact? Or why do we shift into a different gear when all of a sudden our partner, our team, there's a moment where our mess up is right in front of us and it's staring at us in the face and we're realizing it and it's like, oh, geez, here we are. From a nervous system perspective, apologizing can be surprisingly activating because accountability can feel, in fact, like exposure. So if your system learned, which most systems learn as we were younger or in settings that were around others or whatnot, the system learned that being wrong meant also being shamed, punished, rejected often, and unsafe. Then even a small mistake going remotely near that can feel like a threat to our identity. And I really want to name that because this is something that I see so much. And this is why when I ask people about their relationships and or intimate relationships and or team, what is their relationship to apologies? Or what type of apologies usually happen when someone messes up? And if I hear that there's no apologies going on, there's never an I'm sorry and naming the accountability and impact, right? The two elements that the research continuously shows right here, acknowledging what the impact was and your responsibility in it, and then working to repair. What ends up happening? Trust ends up falling out from underneath whatever relationship that is, be it a team, an intimate relationship, a family, etc. And I realized that, wow, if the nervous system can't go near an apology with a 10-foot pole, because ultimately that mistake or making that mistake feels like a threat to the identity, then why would there be enough necessity when it's a threat to our identity to go near an apology? It wouldn't make sense. So the body, more often than not, why those apologies aren't there, why we're not saying I'm sorry and naming the specific impact and acknowledging our role playing in that as well as moving into repair, is oftentimes way more about our nervous system and how it moves into protection than any conscious thought can really be conceived of before. Now, before you go and have, thank goodness, like I'm not the only one that struggles with that. That maybe means that I don't have to apologize. No, let's name how our bodies move into protection so that we can understand and maybe see that in others around us so that we can raise the vibration of the room. When we notice that, we can name it. So let's talk about that moving into protection for a second. When the body moves into protection, there's a couple of ways in which that protection itself might show up. Now, one of the biggest ones you'll notice is when there's defending, there's explaining, there's minimizing, there's blaming, there's collapsing, there's avoiding, and pretty much anything that's close to that. Not because you do not care, but ultimately that happens because your nervous system, what it's trying to do is escape the feeling of being exposed. And that is why regulation matters in apology. You need enough internal safety in here to stay present with the impact that has happened without making the moment about your own survival. I'm sure you can think of someone who you've had an interaction with, or maybe, you are currently interacting with, who just is always going into maybe one pattern or the other. Maybe it's defensiveness, maybe it's avoidance, maybe the moment where an apology would be really nice to hear, they're actually making it about me, right? Them. And it drives you crazy. It drives you nuts because they can't seem to get outside of that me bubble. That is their nervous system talking. And this is where, from my perspective and what I've seen and what I've researched and what I've learned and what I've observed with so many clients and so many community members, that this is where a lot of the apology, quote unquote, advice, it stays way too shallow. And this is where in Eve and on these videos, I want to take it a layer deeper because it focuses just on the words, right? If you were to type into Google how to apologize, the words would be there, but it wouldn't be the deeper layers that we're talking about here. And the truth is, the words, you know it, you've experienced it, and you've been on the other side. The words are not enough. If the nervous system that's underneath those words are in fact defensive, collapsed, or trying to ultimately regain control. And you can feel this. You might not have ever had words to it. As a matter of fact, for a long time, I didn't. But people can feel the difference between I'm saying sorry so that this can be over, and I'm saying sorry because I understand something happened here and I really care about repairing it. The apology itself is verbal, but repair is relational. So let's take a moment, kind of let that settle in. Interesting. The apology is verbal. The repair is relational. Now, let's go a little bit deeper, because this also connects directly to our identities. And of course, Amelia's got to layer this in, because if we're not touching on this, if we're not scraping beneath the surface, we're not doing our jobs here. Because if you believe that being wrong all of a sudden also means being bad at the core of who you are, then accountability will ultimately feel unbearable to your nervous system. You will defend your goodness instead of owning your impact. I'm thinking of a couple people who have been in that chair, and it's so difficult to relationally repair with them. But a more integrated identity, let's just kind of think about it. It can have this two things can be true at the same time. I love this, right? So the integrated identity, it says, I can be good and still have caused harm to others, harm on the world, harm on nature. Whoa, two things true at the same time? Whoa, that's identity, that's nervous system. That's an integrated identity. It can also say, I can be loving and still need to repair. I can be responsible without being irredeemable. And I can own impact without collapsing again and again into shame. That, holding those two things, that's maturity. It's not perfection. We're not going for that. The capacity to stay intact while taking responsibility and naming what that is. So, Amelia, okay, bring all this together for me. Let's use simple, practical tools to actually use this in your day-to-day. And I invite you, after watching this video, go and do something with it. Go and try out an apology. Go and try out these 3 steps, even if it's not a huge, big moment where you notice maybe you acted out of alignment, or maybe you said something, or maybe you caused confusion. There was an impact on how you showed up. Let's apologize with accountability and notice that it's not just about the words that we choose, the voice that we say it with, the tonality, but it's also with the level of accountability that we show up with in our nervous system, in how we say things, and the identity level that we're trying to no longer protect underneath. So step number 1, let's just name flat out what happened. Let's not make this overarching, well, I'm sorry, this is what happened. I'm sorry for everything. No, let's be very specific. Not the I'm sorry for everything that happened last night. Instead, I interrupted you last night. I dismissed what you were saying. I raised my voice last night. I made a decision last night to leave without giving enough context as to why. And I moved into fixing when really you needed presence. When you can create a level of specificity like that, it creates safety, because it shows that the other person, you actually see the moment. And to that other person, they see that you see the moment. They see that you understand it. And they're more apt to understand that, whoa, this is accountability, and you're taking responsibility before you move into step 2 and 3. So step number 2, what do we do after we named what happened in that level of specificity? Step 2 is where we name the impact. And this is scary for a lot of us, because this is where you show that you understand why it mattered. That probably made you feel unheard. When I didn't give you that context, I feel like I can pretty much see how that created pressure inside of you. Or I imagine that felt dismissive. Or that may have been really hard for you, especially to trust me in that moment when I was headed out the door. Can you imagine? You do not need to perform certainty. Instead, you can ask, is that really what happened for you? Did I get that right? Is that how it felt inside of you? What did you notice? But what you don't want to do in step number 2, you do not want to skip the impact that you caused, because impact is where repair and relationship begins. So when you have that out there, you have the specificity, you're naming the impact. Impact is the point where relational repair can begin. So step number 3 is offering that repair or ultimately a changed behavior. A lot of the times I hear apologies without any intention to actually change the behavior. And this is the part that many apologies miss. What I'll do differently next time is pause before responding. Next time, I'll just ask whether you want advice or to be heard. Hey, babe, I'll communicate the context way before changing the priority. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that I didn't do that. Or I want to revisit this conversation when we are both regulated. You see what that does? It actually showcases some movement, and repair itself needs that movement, not just remorse. So, if you want to become better at repair, you want to be relationally rich in the aspect of navigating interpersonal dynamics, do not just practice saying sorry faster. Trust me, my friends, it is not going to get you anywhere faster, except for faster disconnected. Instead, I invite you to practice staying regulated enough to own the impact of your words, your actions cleanly. Practice naming what happened. Name then the impact, and then offer repair. Because the most healing apologies from human to human are not, in fact, the ones that make the apologizer look good. And honestly, it actually feels the opposite. They are, in fact, the ones that help the other person feel less alone with what, in fact, happened. So, a real apology at the end of the day is not asking for the other person to forget the rupture. It helps them feel that the rupture itself has been seen, owned, and cared for. And this is what makes repair possible. Not perfect words, not self-punishment, presence, ownership, and the willingness to do something different.
And if you want to dig a little bit deeper, you want to actually go a little bit further in the specific practical application in your world, join me and other evolvers at EVE Reflections, where we will dig into this together as a community, where you're not alone and where you are working on this with other evolvers. Click the link in the show notes. You'll get access to that. And I'm excited to continue this work together as we evolve together. Take care, everyone. Until next time, keep evolving.